Hello everybody, my name is Vivian Lee, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my project, which was LSTM modeling of COVID-19 cases using weather, mobility, and demographic variables. I interned at the University of Maryland with Ms. Heidi Komkov. So first, a little bit about why I chose to pursue this project. Obviously, case prediction is really important during pandemics because governments are straddling the line between keeping everybody safe and also making sure that our economy and regular life doesn't fall under completely. Obviously, there are a lot of COVID-19 models already out there, but I noticed that most of them use traditional statistical regression models or epidemiological models like SEIR or SIR, but not really many with machine learning, so that was something that I wanted to try. Therefore, my project goal was to predict COVID-19 case trends with machine learning, and I also tried to resolve the regional modeling problem, which I will talk a little bit about next. So the regional modeling problem was coined by Kratzer et al. In Australia, and they found that their basin-specific hydrological models failed when they were applied across the board. So these models have been developed for decades and also for very specific regions. So when they were just tested on a different geographical region, they performed really terribly. And Kratzer et al. Wanted to find a way to kind of generalize these models, and he did it with machine learning by calibrating with static attributes such as like how big the basin is, how much rainfall that they usually expect in that geographical area. They were able to kind of calibrate the model for specific areas and use one big model that was kind of tuned with those static attributes to predict their hydrological modeling. Even though their study was concerning hydrological modeling, I found that there were really a lot of parallels to the issues that we find in COVID-19 modeling. Many of the studies that are already published about COVID-19 case prediction are all hyper-specific to a region, such as like case prediction in Spain or case prediction in the Bronx, New York. And I wanted to see if I could apply the same idea to use static attributes, specifically demographic attributes, such as like how is the population density and what's the percentage of people over 60 living there. And I wanted to factor those in and see if I could use that to create one model that would predict cases across the US. So they modified traditional LSTM architecture to create an entity-aware LSTM. And this architecture separates the static data input from the dynamic data input, so you could use your demographic data as the static data that calibrates the model, and your dynamic data would be the time series that you have, such as the cases that you're trying to predict, or in my case, the mobility trends and the environmental variables. So it also facilitates the observation of the impact of actually incorporating that static data, which is something that I will talk about later on, kind of like the benefit of including the demographic variables and whether that calibration is actually producing a significant impact on how accurate your model is. So this compares a forward pass through an LSTM versus an EA LSTM, and as you can see from the equations, the input gate is no longer a time series, and your input, so that's X, is now separated into XS, or the static data, and XD, the dynamic data. And other than that, they're pretty similar. And as you can see from our diagram, you have your cell state, which is, kind of like the hallmark of the LSTM architecture that preserves that data. You still have that forget gate and those input gates. But as you can see from the bottom, there's now a dynamic input and a static input, which inform different parts of the model. So for my project, it was actually pretty informally organized, so I had to develop my own project idea and find my own data, so I kind of hunted the internet for data that was publicly available. And obviously the first thing that I needed to find was COVID-19 cases. So I got my COVID-19 case data from Johns Hopkins, and they run this huge GitHub database with a bunch of global situation reports as well as time series for every single day. And I utilized the daily cumulative case counts and the daily deaths. Next, I had to find demographic data, which I found from the US Census Bureau and the US Bureau for Economic Analysis, and I looked at a bunch of race, age, and class variables such as like poverty, median household income, percent minority population, people over 60, everything like that. And then I found daily weather data from the Weather Underground personal weather stations, which are set up all across the US, and I looked at average temperature, dew point, humidity, wind speed, and pressure. And the way that I did this was by taking the shapefiles for every county, finding the centroid, and then using a series of Python scripts to send URL requests to first figure out the nearest station to that centroid, and then to scrape the data from that station. Next, I got my mobility trend data from Apple, and they actually started tracking these with the pandemic. And what they do is they just figure out how often people are sending requests to get Apple Maps directions, and they kept track of that. There was driving data, transit data, and walking data, and I chose to use the driving data because it was most consistent and there was more data for it. For my experimental design, I used March 1st through June 30th as my training period, and July 1st through August 23rd as my validation period. I utilized 628 US counties across the country, and I had to first determine my hyperparameters and then run my model with various data sets. For tuning my hyperparameters, I was looking at the sequence length, hidden state size, and dropout rate. And the way I did this was I just ran it with every single combination, and I figured out what was most accurate across the board. And for my analysis metrics, I looked at root mean squared error, mean error, and correlation. So based on my cumulative density plots, I decided on a sequence length of 1 week, since the majority of the error was distributed closer towards 0 for that line on the graph. Then, using a sequence length of 1 week, I ran 16 cases for hidden state size and dropout rate, and I chose a hidden state size of 192 and a dropout rate of 0.1. Again, for the error, I chose the one that was distributed most to the left, because that would be like most of it having lower error. And then, as you can see, the second plot on the right is for correlation, and since I want my correlation to be higher, I chose the one that was distributed most to the right. So my main goal was to see which data sets mattered more. So I took a look at mobility data, environmental data, and demographic data. I wanted to know which one really mattered. So I ran each case with 9 seeds, and I had 3 cases. So the first one was using all of the data, and the second case was only using the mobility and weather data, so I was excluding the demographic data. And for the third case, I was excluding the mobility data and only using the demographic and weather data. And again, I used cumulative density plots to analyze these results. As you can see from my error analysis plots, excluding the mobility data really had no impact on the error whatsoever. When we didn't use it, the error didn't get worse, but when we excluded the demographic data, the error did in fact get more distributed toward higher numbers, which just means that including that demographic data made the model more accurate. Next, from my correlation analysis, there are actually 3 distinct lines this time, since excluding the mobility data did have an impact and lowered the correlation, but excluding the demographic data produced an even bigger decrease in correlation. So we know that although both mobility and demographic data helped, the demographic data certainly made a bigger impact on increasing the correlation. Finally, we know that the regional modeling problem was real and that we were able to solve it, since our demographic data that we were using to calibrate our model produced a significant impact both on the error level and on the correlation level. And we also figured out that we can make machine learning-based epidemiological models. In future research, I'd want to compare machine learning models to existing benchmark models, such as the SEIR model, to see how it would perform. I'd want to apply demographic data to other regional models to see if incorporating that data would actually make it more accurate. And I'd want to repeat the project with more data, since at the time when I was creating this model, there were only 5 months of data available, and now there's many more months of data available. I'd want to increase our sample size and work more on data reconciliation, since I got my data from a bunch of sources and I had to find the counties where there was data for every single variable from every single source. And I'd want to incorporate more variables as well, such as the EPA air quality data, which I spent some time with but wasn't able to get it to fully work, as well as mask data, since we have kind of like an implicit measure of how out and about people are, but obviously whether or not they are wearing masks will significantly impact how many cases there are in that region, as well as policy measures to give a more concrete idea of when lockdowns happen and when the government is taking action and how that impacts the case counts. I'd love to thank my mentor, Ms. Heidi Komkov, our lab PI, Dr. Daniel Lathrop, as well as Ms. Bossi for making this all possible. Thank you so much.